Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. In a 1939 play, T.S. Eliot posed the question, where does one go from an age of insanity? 75 years on, this question has not lost its force. Where does one go from an age of insanity? Eliot's reply was, one goes somewhere on the other side of despair. In today's podcast, Christopher Snook, a scholar of T.S. Eliot and a poet himself, takes this question and its response as the jumping-off point for a beautiful lecture on one of Eliot's greatest poems, indeed one of the greatest poetic works of the 20th century, The Wasteland. The Wasteland arose at the intersection of a personal and cultural crisis as Eliot struggled to make sense of the breakdown and fragmentation of his world, his relationships, and his own psyche in the wake of untold losses. What he produced is a masterful, mournful meditation on the longing for redemption and wholeness amidst fragmentation and decay. The poem's most famous line, "These fragments have I shored against my ruins," captures the essence of Eliot's project, a labor of recovery and discovery in the borderlands between hope and despair. A meditation on a fundamental question, perhaps the fundamental question, whether in the fragments of ourselves and of the world, there is something more. This lecture was given as part of our Master's in the Humanities Program at Ralston College, and it's a great privilege to share it with you here. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening.
I was trying to think of a joke with which to begin, but I couldn't. I've had a lot of time to prepare, so we'll just start. I just wanted to begin by thanking Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Bryson so much for the invitation to be with you this week. Particularly a joy to be with you with a very dear friend of mine, Alan Hall, and to see a very dear friend and very old friend, Stephen Blackwood. But I also wanted to thank Miss Hilary Tucker for her remarkable patience. I'm not especially timely with email correspondence, so she was very patient with my slow-paced communication. And I also wanted to thank you all because I will test your patience by the end of this lecture. So thank you. Thank you in advance. I did want to begin, though, by saying that it's a real privilege to explore with you the poetry of T.S. Eliot, partly because he's been a companion of my own for decades now, someone I really encountered first in the company of Alan Hall and Stephen Blackwood many, many decades ago. And he is not an insignificant part of the kind of mental furniture of my own mind, which has largely otherwise been shaped by teaching in a Grey Books program in Nova Scotia. That is to say, the mental furniture, the fragments, things remembered and half remembered. He's a very significant part of that world. Though so too is a lot of dialogue from the Gilmore Girls. So that's just to say it's a mess up there, and you should always remember, Dante, you will get what you love in the end. So we'll see who wins out, T.S. Eliot or the Gilmore Girls. So I'll just begin. It's from line 19 of The Wasteland. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. So the primary text for our time together this morning, though I know 3 readings were assigned, is arguably the single most significant English language poem of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Something of the poem's promise was in the air even before its publication in 1922, in a bid, for example, to shore up its reputation as the most progressive of progressive literary establishments. America's foremost journal of experimental poetry, The Dial, offered T.S. Eliot roughly the equivalent of $60,000 for the poem Sight Unseen. Likewise, Ezra Pound, the most notorious of modernist poets, who served as midwife to Eliot's text, suggested that the poem was so remarkable that every other poet of the early 20th century ought to close up shop. But despite this anticipation, so there was widespread anticipation, the poem's early reception offered little suggestion or indication of its eventual success. Immediate responses were, to say the least, mixed. One reviewer of the poem, for example, suggested that the Wasteland was little more than waste paper. If any of you felt that way, please don't tell me if you felt that way. Another slightly more sympathetic critic recognized that a poem might be difficult, referring to the difficulty of the poem, might be difficult if it were communicating hard truths, but went on to say that Eliot's poem sadly offered no truth at all. And still another said that he could see Eliot sneering at the world behind the tapestry of difficult illusions that make up the texture of the poem. And yet relatively quickly, despite these early receptions, The Wasteland was also received as the archetypal and authoritative expression of an entire generation's disaffection. For example, an early reviewer notes that The Wasteland, and here I quote from Burton Roscoe, gives voice to the universal despair or resignation arising from the spiritual and economic consequences of World War I, the cross purposes of modern civilization, the cul-de-sac into which both science and philosophy seem to have gotten themselves, and the breakdown, this might be interesting to think about with respect to your theme this year of the whole, the breakdown of all great purposes which give joy and zest to the business of living. Later, the poet Kathleen Raine, whom some of you may know, observed that Eliot was the poet who took upon himself the burden of experiencing the world for his generation. It is not every poet who has found himself compelled to be the prophet of truths so terrible. Though Eliot claimed, I think somewhat disingenuously, that the work was simply an effort to relieve his personal grouse against life, the poem's authoritative status was secured within a decade of its appearance. Indeed, its canonization as the quintessential modernist literary work has resulted in its widespread anthologizing and its near continuous reading for just over 100 years. And so this week, for those of you who've not encountered the poem before, this week will enter into the ranks of that great reading public. So my plan for this morning's lecture is actually quite simple. In the first half, I'd like to briefly explore Eliot's life and the modernist context of this poem's creation, both in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, the First World War, and at a time of severe psychological distress for Eliot. So that's to say that the poem might be said to emerge at the intersection or from the intersection of both a cultural and a personal crisis. You may, in anticipation of Wednesday's lecture, want to think about the parallel between Eliot's context, personal and cultural crisis, and Dante's context, that is to say, crisis of empire and personal crisis of exile. There's a kind of, I think for Eliot, there's a kind of crucial point of comparison there. But secondly, having thought about the context of the poem and its emergence, the second half of the lecture will offer a close reading. I'd like to walk through The Wasteland and highlight some key passages of what I've called here Eliot's Sibylline oracles. The reason for that will become clear when we look at the epigraph to the poem. I think it will become clear why I've called it his Sibylline oracles, though you may already be thinking of Virgil's Aeneid. At the heart of this lecture is a very simple argument, namely that the early works of Eliot that you've been asked to read for this week, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, tradition, and the individual talent. And then, of course, this poem, The Wasteland, which is the latest of Eliot's works we're considering from 1922, that these works, all of them pose a question. The question, I think, can be articulated in any number of ways, but Eliot does so for us in a play from 1939, in which he has a character ask, where does one go in an age of insanity? So that, I think, is the sort of description in a nutshell of the early 20th century for Eliot. And the response in the play comes, one goes somewhere on the other side of despair. So I want to track this question, where does one go, today? And then in our second lecture this week that will explore Eliot's relationship to Dante more in depth, think about what might lie on the other side of despair, at least in the context of Eliot's work. So please forgive me if this is more or less formal than customarily is the case. Yes, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure why I asked you if I don't have another plan. So this is what you get. This is what you get. Okay. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri, on September 26, 1888, to a wealthy and very influential family dedicated to the ideals of moral improvement and public service that animated much of late 19th century American culture. That ideal of progress, I think, is important to have in mind, both of the person and of the nation, was by the time of Eliot's birth a well-established cultural assumption. Things move from worse to better, from less complex to more, from primitive to cultured. This was a well-established cultural assumption with deep roots in the scientific and the literary, commercial, and philosophical life of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Though born in Missouri, you may know already that Eliot's family was, in fact, not native to the Midwest. Rather, Eliot belonged to the intellectual and professional elite of America's eastern seaboard, the Boston Brahmins. And so naturally enough, he pursued his university studies at Harvard, eventually submitting a doctoral dissertation in philosophy by roughly 1914. He never went on to defend that dissertation, but nonetheless submitted it. For our purposes, I think it's useful to note that Eliot first went to Europe in 1910 as part of a year abroad, visiting London in 1911, returning to Harvard for the years between 1911 and 1915, when he finally settled permanently in England, becoming in the minds of many a British poet, though of course himself well aware and important for us to remember, a fundamentally American thinker and writer. The list of Eliot's acquaintances in these early years of his doctoral work and as an emerging critic and poet reads as a kind of who's who of modern intellectuals. In Paris, for example, he attended the lectures of Henri Bergson. Many people argue that Bergson's notions of time are present in Eliot's poetry. He was on intimate and very strange terms with the British philosopher and public intellectual Bertrand Russell. He met and was published by Virginia and Leonard Woolf. And most significantly for The Wasteland, he became a close companion of the most infamous poet of the early part of the 20th century, Ezra Pound. So you can see Pound here, and this is just an indication. Pound, of course, the poem is dedicated to Pound. This gives you a sense of the editorial work that Pound was engaged in that reduced the poem from somewhere around 1,500 lines to the roughly slightly less than 500 lines that we have now. The Wasteland was published in 1922, a year that is often called the year of miracles. 1922 saw not only the publication of The Wasteland, but also the appearance of James Joyce's Ulysses, considered the great modernist novel, so it often considered the novel form of The Wasteland, or The Wasteland, the poetic form of that novel. This year also saw the first English translation of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus, Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, both volumes in English for the first time of Spengler's Decline and Fall of the West. You might want to think about that title in relation to Eliot, as well as the appearance in English translation of the first parts of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. That, too, a title worth considering in relation to the Wasteland. There's some others here. That Harlem Shadowed by Claude McKay, of course, also in certain sense inaugurating the Harlem Renaissance. But though published in 1922, the poem was largely composed in 1921, during a time of immense personal distress for Eliot. Towards the end of that year, Eliot received a 3-month leave from his work in the Colonial and Foreign Department of Lloyd's Bank in England, in the wake of a nervous breakdown precipitated in part by the chronic tensions that animated Eliot's marriage. If you've not had, or if you had not had a personal breakdown in the early 20th century, it was almost a sure indication that you would have little literary success. As he writes in our poem, "My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me." Eliot observed later in his life that his wife, Vivian, in their marriage, found little more than disappointment rather than happiness. What Eliot found, he said, I can't even say it without laughing. Eliot found in their marriage the state of mind required to write The Wasteland. Eliot's complaints of worn nerves, he self-diagnosed himself as having neurasthenia. It's a term coined in 1869 by an American doctor. Eliot's complaints of neurasthenia captured more, I think, than the anguish of his unhappy marriage. Rather, Eliot's Europe, his new home, was awash in the psychologically fractured, the anxious, and the displaced. And this was prior to the First World War. So August Strindberg, for example, asks in 1894, "What is happening to me? Are my nerves undergoing an evolution towards oversensitivity? And are my senses becoming much too delicate? Am I becoming a modern man?" Pose that to my students most of the time. Viennese cultural critic notes Riley in the same time, 1891, when modernism says man, it actually means nerves. Remarkably, the age of anxiety that attended the transition between the 19th and 20th centuries was also accompanied by astounding revolutions in artistic forms, which seemed to breed uncontrollably at the turn of the 20th century. From neo-impressionism to cubism to Dadaism, surrealism, and futurism, there was an explosion of artistic schools and manifestos united by little more than a shared conviction that received forms of art, literature, and philosophy could no longer speak to the modern person. One must instead, as Ezra Pound insisted, make it new. These new schools of art that proliferated around the turn of the 20th century, both prior to and after the First World War, they seem to move in two directions. There was, on the one hand, a kind of heightened frivolity or even enervation among the futurists and the Dadaists, who professed at times an almost pathological glee in the destruction and absurdity of 20th century culture. The First World War itself was initially seen by the godfather of the futurists, though not by him alone, also by folks not connected to the movement, as a great movement of cultural purification. If you've seen Taxi Driver, you might note that Robert De Niro's character has a similar kind of relationship. His desire that a great rain would come and wash the gutters clean. The title of Marinetti's 1915 book of poems, I think, captures the futurist orientation. It's called War, the Only Hygiene of the World. Dadaism offered a slightly less dark, but nonetheless relentless assault on rationality and causal connections. Hugo Ball captures the spirit wonderfully. In 1916, he writes in his manifesto of Dadaism, "How does one achieve eternal bliss? By saying Dada. How does one become famous? By saying Dada. With a noble gesture and delicate propriety, till one goes crazy, till one loses consciousness. How can one get rid of everything that smacks of journalism, worms, everything nice and right, blinkered, moralistic, Europeanized, enervated, by saying Dada? Dada is the world soul. Dada is the pawn shop. The borderline psychopathology of these movements finds, that's maybe trying not to judge, but anyway, the borderline psychopathology of these movements finds its counterpart on the other hand. So I suggested these modernisms, these forms move in two directions. So one direction is this kind of frivolity and enervation. The other direction is the kind of melancholy modernism that we encounter in a poet like Eliot. While agreeing wholeheartedly with the modernist imperative to make it new, Eliot's work is a kind of mournful cultural sifting that seeks, as he writes, to, quote, retain what was known, but under different conditions. Now, Eliot, of course, says that poetry never improves. There is no improvement in poetry. There is simply a reconsideration of received norms, images, and themes in the context of new conditions. The effect of this relationship to poetic work was for Eliot a kind of poetics of juxtaposition. And so in The Wasteland, for example, the lively 1920s dance tune, the Shakespearean rag at line 128, resolves itself into the tragic Shakespearean Ophelia at line 171, suggesting a profound dislocation beneath the carefree playfulness of the Roaring Twenties. It's perhaps best imaged if you look, I won't show it today, but if you look at images of soldiers suffering shell shock and then compare that to images of people dancing the Charleston and the Turkey Trot, I think you'll see that those dances could never have emerged if it were not for the experience of the shell shock. There's no way. The movements are almost identical. Shell shock without the rhythm. The Turkey Trot is simply shell shock, but with rhythm. I mean, it's very interesting to look at, actually. Likewise, the potentially salvific wisdom fragment in the poem, the Sanskrit syllable da, easily collapses into Dadaist revolt, right? So we'll talk about the da, the three das at the end of the poem. But of course, for Eliot, those das, they're playing in a world where the Dada is also present. So their salvific content is almost immediately undercut. These divergent modernisms, the excited and enervated and frivolous, the mournful, these divergent modernisms with their sense that either the past and its consolations had retreated, or that it was a ready-made target, that is to say the past, ripe for demolition, encountered a new and dramatic crisis in 1914 with the apocalypse of World War I. For many, as for the American novelist Henry James, the war definitively undermined any uncomplicated story of cultural progress. And so he writes, the plunge of civilization into this abyss of blood and darkness is a thing that gives away the whole long age, during which we have supposed the world to be, with whatever abatement, gradually bettering. With some 40 million casualties, including 10 million military deaths, 9 million civilian deaths, and nearly 20 million military injuries, the scale of the war was unprecedented. The Canadian painter F.H. Varley, for whom the land on which the war itself was fought bore witness to a vast cultural transformation and collapse, captures, I think, the mood of the period. In a letter to his wife, he writes, "You in Canada cannot realize what war is like. You must see and live it. You must see the barren desert war has made of once fertile country, see the turned up graves, see the dead on the field, freakishly mutilated, headless, legless, stomachless, a perfect body and a passive face and a broken, empty skull. See your own countrymen unidentified, thrown in a cart, their coats over them, boys digging a grave in a land of yellow, slimy mud and green pools of water under a weeping sky." As you'll have noticed already from your reading, the war's deformations percolate throughout Eliot's Wasteland. Section 1 of the poem, for example, establishes a direct parallel between the ancient Punic Wars of Rome and Carthage and the modern Western Front. The pilgrim of the Wasteland, in direct imitation of Dante's constant encounters with former acquaintances and associates in the Divine Comedy, he spies at the end of section 1 of the poem an acquaintance among the crowds that are flowing over London Bridge. Here I quote from the poem, "There I saw one I knew." Remember, think of how often Dante says something comparable. "And I stopped him crying, 'Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at my lay, the Punic Wars, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year?" Having read The Tempest, you might keep in mind Eliot's recollection here of the old antagonism between Carthage and Rome. He's sort of layering the First World War on top of that ancient conflict, right? So they kind of permeate one another. But you might have The Tempest in mind not only because it's one of the central texts that Eliot refers to throughout this poem, but also because that play actually concludes in a certain sense with the reconciliation of Carthage and Rome, if you think about the multiple marriages that happen in the context of that play. So what Shakespeare's doing is actually, in a certain sense, cosmic in its dimensions, the reconciliation that occurs in The Tempest. At least that's my reading of that play. In section 2 of the poem, there's, of course, another reference to the First World War. Explicitly, Eliot walks the reader directly into the trenches. "I think we are in Rat's Alley, the trench, where the dead men lost their bones." So the challenge for artists after the war was how to represent a post-war world whose inherited ideals and grand narratives of progress had been, it seemed, reduced to fragments. Fragments, of course, are a key characteristic of the modernist aesthetic, and Eliot's poem is the example par excellence. Modernism in this context is just a blanket statement. It refers to a movement in the arts, often periodized as, at least in its initial stages, belonging roughly to the first 30 years of the 20th century. Its characteristics are everywhere evident in the Wasteland, including the use of collage, a preoccupation with the problem of self-consciousness, right, that people turned in on themselves, the juxtaposition of high and low culture, and the abandonment of linear narrative. These are just some of the kind of common features of modernist texts. The interest in collage, I think, is important to have in mind. That is to say, the juxtaposition of what seem to be otherwise unconnected bits and pieces in service of a larger whole, as well as the use of multiple perspectives. Both of these, I think, should be kept in mind because they are best seen in the visual arts. So in the works, for example, of Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Marcel Duchamp, and others. So collage becomes a kind of primary artistic medium, a form, in the early 20th century, the kind of taking of bits and pieces, as you might have done as children, and kind of piecing them together, their juxtaposition, the cubism and kind of perspectivism of paintings like this, Nude Descending Staircase by Duchamp, but also the kind of defamiliarization of customary images, the pulling out, for example, of this urinal, very famously called the Fountain, by Marcel Duchamp, who wrote the name of one of his critics here on the side, 1917, and I'll say a word about photography as well. This painterly preoccupation with viewpoint had its analogies in popular culture, but also this sort of shifting of viewpoint, as you can see in the central painting. The flickers, or movies, were a new and radically disorienting media entirely dependent on montage, with its attendant rapid temporal and spatial shifts. Likewise, photography had become a source of amazement and even cognitive dissonance as it parsed otherwise continuous motions. So a galloping horse, for example, as evidenced here, could become a series of contingent moments, just as a woman walking downstairs can become Duchamp's Nude Descending Staircase. So there is, at the level of perception, a kind of fragmentation relative to the new technologies available and the new forms of media. Eliot's method of juxtaposing textual fragments and literary allusions in a kind of verbal collage is called technically parataxis. And for Eliot, this is a central feature of poetic composition, in part because poetry, he writes in 1956, is primarily a way of assembling the most disparate and unlikely material to make a new whole. This is a kind of definition he offers later in his life. But crucially, I want to suggest that this poetic form for Eliot, this assemblage of diverse fragments to constitute a new whole, really emerges from an anthropology, from an understanding of the human. And he articulates it in his doctoral dissertation on F.H. Bradley, the idealist philosopher. In his dissertation, Eliot writes, "The life of a soul does not consist in the contemplation of one consistent world, but in the painful task of unifying jarring and incompatible ones, and passing where possible from two or more discordant viewpoints to a higher, which shall somehow include and transmute them." So you might, of course, I know you've read the Phenomenology, you might think of Hegel here. Not that Eliot is particularly there in a way, but there is something comparable to Hegel's idea of dialectic. But to put this in terms that may resonate with your studies of Plato and Dante, the soul for Eliot is a kind of synthesizing principle, or as he might say, a receptacle or field of awareness that does the hard work of establishing connections and relationships between the dizzying diversities of human experience. We might think about that a bit more on Wednesday evening. So I think it's helpful to begin our kind of entrance into the poem, where the poem itself begins, with the title and the epigraph and the dedication. With these, Eliot inducts us into the world of the Wasteland through a remarkably productive juxtaposition of fragments. He is, of course, in this juxtaposition attempting to do what he describes in the essay Tradition in the Individual Talent. He is trying to insist not only on the pastness of the past, but of its presence. You might think here of the emerging discourse of psychoanalysis in the early 20th century, and also developments in the social sciences, both of which make an argument that the personal and the cultural past is always present and working up, right? So this has become normative, the ways we think about ourselves psychologically. If I ask you how you're doing and we have a long conversation, one of us will certainly start talking about our childhoods, right? This is just kind of normative for us now in the 21st century, but this idea that belongs in a certain sense to emergent psychoanalysis, but also to the social sciences as they apply new techniques of sociology to thinking about culture and history, this notion of what is under works up is present in some way, I think, in Eliot's own poetry. I've adopted very helpfully in my life the strategy of repression relative to most of those things, so I commend it to you all. The title page of the poem anticipates, I think, the shape of the poem as a whole. So the title page, you'll have noted, includes English, Latin, Greek, and Italian, though German, French, and Sanskrit will soon appear. It includes direct quotations from a medieval and a classical source, and it provides an allusion via the poem's title to a kind of founding myth of medieval Europe, the Arthurian cycle, called, of course, in England, the Matter of Britain. But what is the Wasteland, just to start with the title? T.S. Eliot tells us in his notes for the reading, and I really encourage you to have a kind of ironic relationship to the notes. Eliot introduced, the notes had a very curious history. On the one hand, Eliot circulated drafts of notes with the poem as it was being read, particularly by Ezra Pound, also by his wife Vivian, and commented upon. But he also added them finally because it was required in order to extend the poem, make it long enough to publish as a single book. So he himself suggested later in life that the notes had sent endless number of scholars down endless number of rabbit holes to no good avail. We're going to follow some of those rabbit holes nonetheless, but just I encourage you to hold the notes a little bit lightly. They give and take at the same time, I think. Eliot tells us, though, in the notes for today's reading, that the title for his epic poem is derived from the Grail legends that had been repopularized at the turn of the century by scholars like Jessie Weston and James Fraser. They read the Grail legends of the medieval European world as later developments of more primitive and fundamental vegetative rituals and myths around renewal and fertility, concerned with renewal and fertility. But in this sense, I think Eliot's poem is a strangely modern quest narrative, so I think we should think of it as belonging to the epic tradition, though it is not entirely unlike the work of Wagner, that is to say, maybe particularly the work Parsifal. I know you've considered the Ring Cycle, but I don't think Parsifal, was one. But I think Parsifal is, and Tristan and Isolde, they're the two probably most significant of Wagner's works for this poem. But of course, the particular mythological moment that inspires the title of this poem, that is the search for the Holy Grail, like most of the image gathered in the poem itself, gets amplified very quickly as we move into the work. So for example, the wasteland very quickly becomes the wastelands of the Western Front of the World War. It also becomes very quickly in the poem the desert dry lands of the Hebrew Bible. Beyond this, the allusions become almost riotous. The wasteland of the title is the Gran Deserto, the other way of describing the dark wood of Dante's Inferno. It is Augustine's barren waste, which many of you might have encountered as translated as his region of destitution in Book 2 of the Confessions. We might compound these images almost endlessly. The poem itself does. In its very first section, we'll encounter wastelands that include a literal desert, the desertification of urban life, the fertility of spring described as an ominous disturbance. Even interpersonal relationships throughout the poem will manifest a kind of wasteland sensibility, as people are either unable or unwilling to extend themselves beyond the limits of their own subjectivity. In this sense, it seems to me, Eliot is going to suggest in this poem, and we'll see this most strongly when we look at section 5, that coming to believe that other people exist as centers of consciousness and emotion as real and urgent as our own is one of the central problems of contemporary life. This you'll see in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but I think we see it most powerfully at the very end of The Wasteland. Or maybe just say that again, just in case I wasn't clear. So I think one of the things Eliot is concerned with here is the problem of 20th century solipsism. That is to say, how do we actually live in such a way that we recognize the urgency of life that belongs to another as identical to the urgency of life I feel relative to myself? How do I know you are real in the way that I am real? Intriguingly, both the title of the poem and the epigraph are later editorial amendments, mediated by Ezra Pound, who himself suggested that he performed a kind of cesarean operation on the poem, which brought it to life. Eliot's working title was actually a fragment of conversation drawn from the novel Hard Times by Charles Dickens. He'd do the police in different voices. That initial title referred to a character named Sloppy, who would read police reports out loud, much to the delight of his listeners, doing different voices for different characters in much the way you might read to a child. But the point of the original title, of course, was simply a kind of explicit indication of the many and multiple viewpoints that animate the poem itself, its many voices. The editorial change, I think, is instructive. It's instructive, I think, for what Pound is doing, but also for getting a sense of what the maturing Eliot is trying to do. Pound jettisons that original title in favor of what I think is a less didactic and far more spacious and productive literary image. But likewise, the epigraph was a later editorial amendment. The original epigraph was drawn from Joseph Conrad's novel, The Heart of Darkness. Conrad's passage is instructive. I'll just read what the original epigraph was. It's curt towards the end of the novel, And the narrator says, did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment, his death, of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, some vision. He cried out twice a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. If you've seen Apocalypse Now, of course, it's impossible not to picture Marlon Brando saying those words. But also, I think that the horror becomes the epigraph for Eliot's later poem, The Hollow Men, which seems in a way to conclude a particular moment of his poetic life, but also I think is a useful way of thinking about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. His love song is a kind of horror. Ezra Pound thought that this relatively intense epigraph was not complex enough for the poem. And he suggested the current epigraph in Latin and in Greek, drawn from a first century text that itself is only available to us in fragments. Again, I think there is a kind of remarkable poetic insight at work in Pound's amendment as he moves Eliot from a more didactic literary moment or choice to an equally powerful but slightly more expansive text. The first feature of the epigraph we might want to note is simply that, like the dedication from Dante's Divine Comedy, The Better Maker, it's not translated. This is more, I think, than a little bit of intellectual snobbery on the part of Eliot and Pound, though, of course, Eliot was consistently derided for these kinds of decisions. Rather, Eliot's use of multiple languages throughout the poem alludes both to the cosmopolitanism of early 20th century European life and to the conflict between national cultures during the First World War. There's an allusion in the second stanza of the poem. Think, for example, of the German fragments that populate the first section, the burial of the dead. But deeper than this, I think Eliot's refusal to translate his source materials points to one of the key dynamics of the poem as a whole, the problem of communication. We live for Eliot after Babel, or Babel, the Tower of Babel, right? We live after Babel. That is to say, we live after that moment recorded in the Hebrew scriptures where the tower that the human community builds to conquer the heavens is destroyed and their languages are dispersed and differentiated, right? To prevent humans from a kind of common understanding that might allow the same sort of technological assault against the heavens. We live after Babel. In this sense, it can't be emphasized strongly enough that the multiplicity of languages in the poem, even the ways in which many first-time readers feel destroyed or defeated as they come up against these difficult and inarticulate moments, is crucial to a sense of the text as a whole. In fact, it's kind of a sadness that every edition of the Wasteland now has footnotes that we can immediately go to. There's a certain sadness there, I think. Part of the incomprehensibility with which readers are meant to be confronted in this poem is an initiation into the misunderstandings and miscommunications that play out between the characters of the poem over and over again. It is also an affirmation of what Eliot was convinced was true of poetry, that it means before the kind of conceptual work we might do, its meaning is derived from rhythm and from image. So that those work in a way at a kind of pre-conscious level, and then we might add a kind of conceptual reflection, but that there's a working in the poetry, the language, and the rhythms themselves. But having said this, translations have their uses. So the epigraph is taken from the Satyricon of Petronius, written in the first century, of Common Era. It reads in translation, "For once I saw with my own eyes the Cumaean Sibyl hanging in a jar, and when the boys asked her, 'Sibyl, what do you want?' she answered, 'I want to die.'" You may recall that the Cumaean Sibyl is herself a complex figure. You will have encountered her in your reading of Virgil's Aeneid, where she is effectively the keeper of the underworld. It is this Sibyl who prophesies Aeneas' future and who inducts him into Hades. And so Virgil writes, "The Cumaean Sibyl chants from the shrine her dread enigmas, and booms from the cavern, wrapping truth in darkness. But this is also the Sibyl, revered by the medieval church, so much so that Michelangelo includes her among the prophets in the paintings of the Sistine Chapel. It is to her that Virgil ascribes the origin of the great Roman prophecy that anticipates a boy king whose reign will usher in an age of peace. It's recorded in his eclogues. This prophecy was received by the medieval church as a pagan foreshadowing of Christ himself. Indeed, Dante alludes to the Sibyl at the very end of the Divine Comedy when he describes all the scattered leaves of our lives, her prophecies written on leaves, bound into a single volume by love. So all of this is present in the choice of the epigraph and all of it relevant. But the text itself, you'll have noted, makes no reference to the Aeneid, nor to the Christian readings of the Sibyl mediated through Virgil, but to a story from the Sibyl's life recorded by Ovid. In the story, the prophetess is offered one wish by the god Apollo. She asks to live as many years as there are grains of sand in her hand. Think of that fear in a handful of dust. She asks to live as many years as there are grains of sand. Apollo grants her the wish, but the Sibyl quickly discovers, or maybe slowly discovers, that not having asked for eternal youth, she withers as she ages, until paradoxically, having yearned for an endless life, she now wants only to die. In this respect, I think the problem of the Sibyl is the problem of the poem. On the one hand, to enter the poem is to be inducted into an underworld, this space of, as Eliot writes, unreal cities. And you might think here particularly of the city of Dis in the Inferno, right? The kind of unreal city, which is to say it mimics or imitates the true city. In Dante's reading, Jerusalem, right? There's a kind of imitation. But on the other hand, and maybe more importantly, the Sibyl as she appears here is a profoundly unprophetic character who was unable to see the ramifications of her wish for an endless life. This impaired prophetic vision, or the prophetic voice whose life is a teaching rather than his or her sayings, will crop up again and again in the poem. Madame Sosostris is perhaps only the most important instance, but there are many. Eliot excavates this experience of the Sibyl, right, who is shriveled and suspended, in his earlier poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I'll just read a few lines. Prufrock writes, and I think this is meant to be a kind of illustration of a state of suspension in which the modern person lives. He writes, I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. Prufrock's despair finds its partner in the Sibyl's plaintive, I want to die. Franz Kafka, I think, early 20th century writer, offers the best possible gloss on both Prufrock and the Sibyl. He writes, there is a goal, but no way. What we call the way is mere wavering. You might think here of the end of Book 5 of Augustine's Confessions, when he adopts the kind of position of a skeptic. He's the refusal to commit, right? He'll neither say yes nor no. So to step into this poem then on the basis of this epigraph is to be inducted by the Sibyl, as was Aeneas, into the underworld, and that world will be populated by those who, like the Sibyl and like Prufrock, are alive and yet somehow dead. It is a kind of zombie apocalypse. They waver or are resigned or find themselves in a state of cultivated boredom. So before breaking, we might just ask the question of the title page, why all of this complexity? I mean, all of this might be said, even simply with English translation, why all of the complexity? Eliot defended the complexity of his poetry and of other modernist poems by suggesting, rightly or wrongly, that modern life included a far greater variety and complexity than ever before. And so he writes in his essay on the metaphysical poets, "It appears likely that poets in our civilization as it exists at present must be difficult. Our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity, and this variety and complexity playing upon a refined sensibility must produce various and complex results. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into meaning." So just before kind of jumping into the poem proper, kind of moving into the sections, and again, what I'd like to do in this half of the lecture is really just to kind of highlight some central themes, more or less in each section of the poem. We may, because we have an opportunity to discuss the poem in the seminars, I'm anxious not to say too much, but also I'd like to leave a lot of room. So I'll try to highlight a few key moments or a key moment in most sections. I may or may not say much about section 4, A Death by Water. Ezra Pound said it was the most important section of the poem, and so for that reason I thought it might be good to say nothing about it, and then we'd leave it for our discussions in seminar. But I may say a very, very brief word about it. But we'll focus on sections 1, 2, and 3 and section 5, and I'll just highlight some key moments. I will try to be mindful of the time, though. I just want to sort of, so I don't move too slowly. So I wanted, before we step into the poem, then just to remind us that the conceit of the poem invites us to imagine ourselves as pilgrims in the wasteland. In that sense, the poem, I think, can be thought of as a kind of modern epic, or we might want to say a modern anti-epic, depending, but it certainly places itself within the context of the epic literary tradition. But more importantly, I also wanted to suggest that though the poem, and I think this relates to, I'm hoping I can say something more thoughtful about this on Wednesday, but I want to suggest that though the poem is fragmentary and episodic in its qualities, this doesn't necessarily imply that the poem is incomplete. Rather, Eliot himself argued that the poem was a coherent whole, which has led some commentators to suggest that there is a coherent argument or through line in the work itself. But at the very least, I think, Eliot wants to suggest that the work is comprehensive. The wholeness of the poem is illuminated, I think, if we simply remember some of the images that are repeated throughout. So, for example, to name only 2, we begin the poem in the mountains. You may remember there's that kind of very interesting moment that seems to be a recollection of a kind of fading aristocratic Europe. We begin in the mountains. "There I feel free," says Marie. But of course, the mountains return in section 5 of the poem, so there's a kind of doubling. Likewise, the river Thames, which appears early in the text, is doubled by the river Ganges at the end. So the profane river and the sacred, the dead city and the dry desert, the mountains, these are all things, and perhaps are things that we might want to think about as identical with one another, the 2 rivers, the mountains, the city, and the desert, simply describing the same realities, but from different perspectives. So maybe just to clarify that thought in case it wasn't clear. So the desert is the city seen from one perspective, just as the city is the desert seen from one perspective. Likewise, the Ganges is the Thames, and the Thames is the Ganges. So all of that is to say the poem is a kind of whole, but it is a curious whole. I think the curiosity of its wholeness is manifest by a very simple detail. There's no final punctuation. So we have the last words, shanti, 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 and nothing, no period. So the poem begins then, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. This poem's most famous line, I think, is almost certainly its opening. April is the cruelest month. Some of you, I suspect, will have noted that this line is actually sampling or alluding to what might be the single most famous English language evocation of spring, the very first lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Eliot's April is very different from Chaucer's. This allusion is highly suggestive. If you look at the opening lines of the Canterbury Tales, which I won't read now just for purposes of time, if you look at the opening lines, you'll see that for Chaucer, spring is a season of rebirth and spiritual pilgrimage. Indeed, April is, in the Christian tradition, the month of resurrection, but it becomes in Eliot a time to resist any impulse to get on the road. As Chaucer says early in the Canterbury Tales, spring is the time that pilgrims go on pilgrimage to thank the saint, Thomas Becket, for the healings that they have received. In Eliot's Wasteland, when spring rains come, they are not an invitation to a joyful expedition. Rather, we're told specifically that when they come, they are painful, stirring up the dull roots of memory and desire. So I'd like to suggest that these roots are important to think about, memory and desire. In a certain sense, they form the kind of dynamic within the context of this poem. If you think simply at the most general level about human subjectivity, memory is the extension of our lives backwards, most often with the point or purpose of establishing some principle of continuity between the current iteration of myself and its previous forms. So memory sort of establishes personality. This would certainly be something you've seen in Augustine. Desire extends a life into the future. But as the poem makes clear, these roots are in fact atrophied, both memory and desire. Memory has been reduced to a heap of broken images. We hear on the very first page, desire is on the fritz. When it appears at all in the wasteland, it is almost always violent or impulsive or hesitant. We'll have to take time to think about the root of desire in our seminars and give maybe some special attention to the hyacinth girl. I think I'll bracket that until the seminars, which is for me, she is one of the most mysterious characters in this poem, though it is clear from Eliot's letters that became public in 2020 that they are a direct reference to Emily Hale, who was sort of his muse for most of his life, a kind of Beatrice figure for Eliot. But how the hyacinth girl functions in the poem is really worth our thinking about together in the seminar. So I'll leave that image of desire for the seminars, but I would like us to think just very briefly about what's described, this sort of kind of slowly waking up root of desire as characterized at the end of section 1 of the poem, The Burial of the Dead. At line 60, Eliot writes, "Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many I had not thought death had undone, so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet." So I suggest here that we're being given an insight into the topography of the wasteland. These lines from the final stanza of section 1 of the poem, again, The Burial of the Dead, present us with a characteristic image of desire that informs much of Eliot's poem. These lines, of course, and I suspect you may have heard it well before looking at the notes, these lines, of course, allude to Dante's Inferno, specifically to the vestibule of hell where those who failed to will either good or evil are relegated to an eternity of neurotic flip-flopping embodied in their frenetic racing back and forth. These are the souls that for Dante are fit neither for heaven nor for hell because having never loved anything, they have never lived. In a certain sense, they can't be recognized as belonging to any community at all, even of the damned. From this perspective, London's early morning commuters are all of them like the Sibyl in the poem's epigraph. They are suspended in a like life-death that may manifest itself as a kind of enervation, as a kind of movement, or perhaps better, they are like those souls in Dante's limbo. So Eliot is conflating moments of the Inferno here, because we are told that like the souls in limbo, these souls sigh for a good they may remember in some nostalgic or partial way, but which they have no hope of attaining. Sighs, short and infrequent. Remember, that's what the souls in limbo, what do? The souls in limbo sigh, right? Because they did not hope enough. This experience seems to me summed up again in words attributed to Franz Kafka. He writes, there is an infinite amount of hope in the world, just not for us. He is funny, Kafka. In a way, he's meant to be laughed at, but he is also so agonizing. Remarkably, this brief section of the poem is a reference to a very early moment in the Inferno, right? So it's kind of placing us at the top. Also pulls us to the very bottom. You'll remember, I think, the souls in ice at the bottom of hell, and we're told by Dante that their eyes are fixed downward. Just like the souls that Eliot is describing, they are staring at their feet. Eliot's Wasteland commuters in London had just become, post-World War I, a city of commuters. Eliot worked in the central business district down, and he saw the evacuation of the residents of that part of the city and the beginning of the sort of commuter culture of contemporary London. Eliot's Wasteland, then, this is to say, his commuters are kind of adumbrations of the underworld, right? They include both the top and the bottom of Dante's Inferno. So I suggested already that the first section of the poem offers us a kind of geography or topography of the wasteland. And we might want to think in our seminars why it's called the burial of the dead. The notes will tell you, which is entirely true, this is simply the name for the burial office, the funeral service in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. But why is that the title? I'm not sure knowing its origins is particularly helpful necessarily for making sense of how it relates to the work. If the first section of the poem offers us a geography of the wasteland, then the second section of the poem gives us, in the words of one scholar, a more concrete illustration. So if the wasteland is this sort of commuter culture, people are fixed, have their eyes fixed before their feet. If that's what it looks like at a global scale, how do we think about it at the more concrete level? The title of the second section of Eliot's poem, I think, is illuminating. It is called The Game of Chess. And as you'll know from any of the notes you may have looked at, the title has multiple origins, each of which I think casts light upon the section's dominant theme of sexual dysfunction. The section sets in contrast the lavish and sensual rooms of a modern-day Cleopatra, and then the barroom story of Lil and Albert's struggling marriage. Its title is drawn from Thomas Middleton's play of the same name, A Game of Chess, which was first produced in 1625. That play is a satirical account of the English-Spanish political conflict, which amounted to a kind of strategic game. This gaming is applied to the intimate encounters in this section of the poem, all of which bear the signs of a kind of strategizing or plotting or planning. But the title of the section also resonates with another Middleton play, Woman Beware Women, in which a young woman is seduced while her mother-in-law plays chess. So again, drawing out the dangers in the wasteland of certain kinds of intimacy. And a third reference, of course, seems to be clearly the chess game of Ferdinand and Miranda in Shakespeare's Tempest, which is in that play, I think, at the very least a reference to the plottings and the stratagems of the play's political antagonists. Though, of course, you'll know that in The Tempest, Miranda forgives the cheating of Ferdinand, and there is some suggestion, I think, in that play, not present in this poem, that forgiveness is a constitutive feature of any political community, right? But that's not present in this poem. This section begins then with a depiction of a woman in sensuous surroundings. We're told that she sits in her chair. Eliot is here pulling directly from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, in which the woman sits in a throne. That difference, I think, is meant to place us in the local, right? We're in London. The section begins with this depiction. We're told about her sensuous surroundings. The smells of the perfumes they're pungent and confusing and disorienting. It may be that this is a London brothel. This is left unclear, but there seems to be some suggestion. And we're told that she is surrounded by woodwork upon which we can see the sylvan scene of the change of Philomel. As Eliot writes, by the barbarous king so rudely forced. If gaming is a feature of sexual encounters in this poem, I want to suggest that Philomel's story is really crucial to making sense of what Eliot means. You may know already, and you may know well better than I do, that Philomel in the Greek tradition was sister-in-law to King Tereus. Teru, we'll see that come up. The barbarous king, as Eliot refers to him. Tereus fell in love with Philomel while collecting her to bring to his kingdom to visit her sister, his wife, Procne. As Ovid writes, the moment he saw the maiden, Tereus was inflamed with love, quick as if one should set fire to ripe grain or dry leaves. His impulse was to corrupt her attendant's care and her nurse's faithfulness, and even by rich gifts to tempt the girl herself, or else to ravish her and to defend his act by bloody war. Keep in mind, Ovid, he was inflamed. Right? We'll think about that in section 3. Tereus brings Philomel to a remote hut, we're told in the story, and when they return to his country, and he there assaults her, rendering her mute afterwards. But she weaves her story on a loom, and it finds its way into Procne, her sister's hands. And to revenge her sister's violation, Philomel and Procne murder the son of Tereus and Procne, and feed him to Tereus at a feast. When this is revealed, he chases them through the forest, and all three are changed into birds. So it's clear that Eliot is here beginning a series of comments on the character of intimate desire in the Wasteland, figuring it as betrayal and violation, and more fundamentally as the product of stratagems whose ramifications are cycles of violence and destruction that affect both social and family bonds. One aspect of this vision of modern love comes out in the tragic story of Lil and Albert's failing marriage. This story follows directly on the heels of the nervous, anxious, and neurotic plaintiveness of lines 111 to 126. I won't look at those now, but many people suggest that Eliot is actually recording specific moments of dialogue between himself and his wife, Vivian, in those lines 111 to 126. Vivian herself commented very positively in manuscripts of the poem on those kind of neurotic lines, those plaintive lines. The first thing to note about Lil and Albert's story is that it's being told to us. The narrator is gossiping with us, a kind of callback to the final words of the poem's first section, in which Eliot cites Charles Baudelaire, who calls his readers hypocrites like himself. So we're being drawn into the narrative of the poem at this point. We are with those who gossip about the failing marriage of Lil and Albert. The content of the story raises the themes of love that were developed in the story of Philomel. Albert, we are told, has been demobbed, which is to say demobilized. He's leaving the army. And so he's returning to his wife, Lil, with the expectation of what was called euphemistically during the war, a little grunt and grumble. You might think here of the song of the nightingale, jug, jug, another euphemism. But the money that he's given to Lil to make herself beautiful for his return, think of the perfumes surrounding the Cleopatra figure, the agents of beauty, has been used to bring off an abortion. Lil is now sick as a result, and the aborted child becomes for Eliot, in some sense, the image of the modern marriage. It is willfully infertile, in large part because the quality of love is purely self-interested. Eliot seems to be drawing a parallel here between the infertility of this relationship and the metaphorical infertility of Procne and Tereus. Remember, of course, Procne murders their son. But there's also something more prosaic, I think, going on here. The lives of the inhabitants of the wasteland are dry and barren as the land itself. These are lives ground down by the harshness and impersonalities that are constitutive of modern life. Events of huge significance, like the collapse of a marriage, become banal, washed out, and inconsequential. They are, in the context of the poem, simply fodder for gossip. You'll have noted in this section of the poem, I'm sorry we don't have time to read the whole section, which would be much more helpful. You'll have noticed that the barkeep keeps yelling, "Hurry up, please, it's time." This is, of course, simply the last call, right, for drinks. But it raises deeper and I think more apocalyptic questions. What is it time for? What is the barkeep demanding? It's unclear what might be precipitated by the call, but the call comes. These themes of infertility and violent sexual appetite come to a head, I think, in the third section of the poem. And I know we're moving quickly here, but will be lots of time to move slowly in the next few days. The third section, called the Fire Sermon. In the second section of the poem, we're given a very discrete, particular example of impoverished married love. But in the third, we are shown what might be called a more global picture of the horrors of the impoverishment of desire, right? That root that's clutching. We're shown a more global picture as we move from the particular to the city as a whole. The central action of this section, I think, is striking, and I would like to read it together. And it introduces us to Tiresias, whom you will know well already. Eliot argues in the notes that Tiresias is the most important personage in the poem, and that he unites all of the rest. He is a spectator, we are told, though not indeed a character. What Tiresias sees, Eliot writes, is the substance of the poem. There's obvious questions to ask about Tiresias. So, for example, Eliot tells us that Tiresias sees. Tiresias in the poem will himself say that I have seen all that has transpired on this divan or bed. But Tiresias is, of course, blind. So what is it that he sees? Just as all the women in this poem, according to Eliot, are one woman, and all the men one man, so all meet, he writes, in Tiresias, the ancient prophet who lived as both a man and a woman. He sees, we are told, and suffers all. But what he sees is deeply disturbing. And again, how he sees this is an interesting question. He sees the assault of a vain young man on an unresisting typist. If in the second section of the poem we saw some sign of passionate attachment to sexual activity, though violent, here we find little or no passion. This is the region of ennui or boredom. And Eliot is borrowing this from Charles Baudelaire, the dangers of ennui, the dangers of a kind of cultivated boredom that belongs to the modern experience. What strikes me as remarkable in this scene is its poetic form, which is why I'd like to read it. The agony of this moment of encounter, which is some strange combination of aggression and passivity, is captured not just in the content of the scene, but precisely in Eliot's use of a particular structure. So Eliot actually inserts here a traditional Shakespearean sonnet, which is very easy to miss. The rhyme schemes that are at work in the poem, I have found, took me years to actually realize they were even there as I read the poem. But Eliot's playing, he's extremely playful and experimental with his use of rhyme scheme. But here he inserts into a poem that's otherwise a strange kind of combination of form and style, and free verse even. He inserts a traditional sonnet, right, with the traditional form, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. The sonnet, you'll know, is a form in a certain sense that presupposes a world of resolutions, because the final couplet is a kind of resolution, or at least clarification, of a problem introduced in the earlier stanzas. So I just want to read this and we can see what becomes of this form. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. This is the young man carbuncular. The meal is ended, she is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses which still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have suffered all enacted on the same divan or bed, I who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead, bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. Like Tiresias, whose provocations in Greek drama are at least productive of hard-won and painful knowledge, so too the sonnet form assumes a kind of world of resolutions. But as you can see, the final two lines of this poem, ending with the off-centered absence of a rhyme scheme, kiss and unlit, are out of tune. The form breaks down in the face of this assault. And in this failure of the sonnet, I think we are meant to see our entrance into a world in which resolutions have become impossible. Reconciliation, even of poetic form, is gone. Right? Any order is too much order. The beginning of the fire sermon section includes references to river nymphs drawn from Wagner's Ring Cycle. At the end of this section, we return to the river again, and those nymphs are transformed into the three daughters of the Thames, whose laments we hear in the final stanzas of this section. The state of the river, as described early in the poems, is indicative of the state of the people who now occupy the city of London. The nymphs, we are told, are departed, the familiar spirits of the water, and there is no detritus of summer evenings that ought to be strewn along the riverbanks. That is to say, some garbage is good garbage, right? Signs of life, signs of animation. All of it is gone. Strikingly, the entire action of the third section of the poem is contained between two images of the river, at the beginning and at the end, in the same way that the story of the Hyacinth Girl is framed between two images of water, in the same way that we will turn to the river in section 5. The fire sermon then brings to mind the warning from section 1 of the poem, Fear Death by Water. The songs of the three Thames daughters reiterate themes we have met early in this section. I raised my knees supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. After the event, he wept, he promised a new start. My people are humble people who expect nothing. The infliction of one person's appetite on another in the first song, the suggestion in the second of some unnamed violation, the failure of hope in the final, all of these themes are taken up poignantly and painfully in this final section, which concludes by placing together two great figures from the aesthetical traditions of the East and the West, the Buddha and St. Augustine. To Carthage, then I came, writes Eliot, burning, 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 O Lord, thou pluckest me out, O Lord, thou pluckest, burning. To what end does Eliot introduce these masters of the spiritual traditions? Many folks have read this section of the poem, whose title, of course, is taken from one of the Buddha's famous sermons, the Fire Sermon. Many people have read this section of the poem as an affirmation of the need for some form of ascetic struggle by which to temper and order the human desires that are so aggressive, violent, or muted in the poem itself. But to my mind, these fragments are in some sense more diagnostic than prescriptive. The narrator, we're told, has come to Carthage, Augustine's city of unholy loves in the Confessions, the site of Dido's ruinous affair, and London, by extension, is now animated primarily by these older, ancient archetypes of painful passion. In Book 3 of Augustine's Confessions, you may recall, Augustine describes his arrival in Carthage with these words, "To Carthage then I came, where there sang all around me in my ears a cauldron of unholy loves. I loved to love, desiring to be scraped by the touch of objects of sense. I was scoured with the burning rods of jealousy and suspicion and fears and angers and quarrels." You might think here of the earlier parts of section 3 of the poem and of the sumptuous rooms. Later in his Confessions, Augustine confesses that well after his conversion, he is still drawn by the world's temptations, but that the Lord plucks him out. But in Eliot's poem, this being plucked out is far from promised. It is arrested and broken and fragmented. O Lord, thou pluckest, but the final word is burning. So given our time, I'd like to turn to the last section of the poem, but I might just say that section 4 of the poem I think is helpfully thought of, or at least reflected upon, or at least you might ask a question whether or not the 4th section, Death by Water, is an evocation of some ritual of purification. Many people, of course, read this section of the poem that way, and there is tremendous evidence to suggest that it is a kind of transformative moment, right? The reference to the tempest, those are pearls that were his eyes, with the suggestion of transformation is present there. But there is also, I think, a very intriguing allusion to Plato. Phlebas is the Phoenician sailor described in section 4 of the poem. There's a kind of connection to Ulysses and Dante as well, but we can talk about that in the seminar. But Phlebas, some people will argue, is actually a kind of contraction of the Philebus, or the Philebus, the Platonic dialogue in which Socrates says it is better to drown than to cling to a falsity. So some people have made that analogy, which I find profoundly persuasive and extremely helpful for thinking about that section. But we'll turn simply to the final section of the poem, What the Thunder Said. The first stanzas of this section, we will read some parts of the poem, but I won't read the first stanzas. But the first stanzas, simply to remind us, are a recapitulation of the beginning of Eliot's poem. And they are also marked by a striking difference. In the very first stanza of section 5, Eliot alludes to the events that lead to the crucifixion of Christ. The frosty silence in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Christ prays before his death, his betrayal, and his arrest. Christ is the one who, Eliot tells us, was living and is now dead. This allusion connects Christ to the hanged God of James Fraser and Jessie Weston, as well as to the tarot deck used by Madame Sosostris to make predictions in section 1 of the poem. You remember that the hanged man is the card that is missing. The death of this god, the hanged god, for Weston and for Fraser, was meant to ensure the renewal and fecundity of the land in early vegetative rituals. Importantly, Christ's body here then echoes or doubles the body buried in the garden that we see in the first section of the poem. Will the body sprout, that is to say, come alive again? So Eliot begins by taking up and expanding earlier themes. But I think the most striking development of the poem in section 5 is the sudden appearance of a desire that seems to have arisen over the course of the poem for water. You'll remember in the very first stanza, the spring melt is experienced as agonizing. It is a kind of pain, right? Which threatens to awaken painfully both memory and desire. But here the water is yearned for. If there were rock and also water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, it is as if all the poem's images of water are now being gathered up and drawn together as potentially salvific, from the hyacinth girl's wet hair to the river Thames to the purgation of Phlebas. Eliot proceeds to place us in the east, on the banks of the Ganges River, the holy river of Hinduism. which might be contrasted with the dirty banks of the Thames written about earlier, though I would suggest that in a way these are the same river, simply seen from different perspectives. But in either case, why Eliot moves us to the east has been a source of almost endless scholarly preoccupation. Some suggest that this has to do with the dissipation of religious traditions in the West. As Friedrich Nietzsche writes in his Genealogy of Morals, the churches have all become sepulchres. Others argue that it is a more general sign that the divine always appears exotic in the context of a parched world. But either way, Eliot makes sacred, almost liturgical, this moment in which the thunder speaks. And he invokes for us the sense that the entire natural world is tensed, waiting for the words of thunder. Eliot draws the title for this section of the poem from a Hindu sacred text in which the god Prajapati speaks the sacred syllable da to an assembly of gods and men and demons. Each of these groups hears the divine injunction, the sacred syllable, in a slightly different way. The gods in the narrative hear control because they are unruly. The men hear give because they are greedy, and the demons hear sympathize because they are cruel. These are the three great disciplines of the Hindu tradition, and the Hindu text concludes by telling us that the divine voice repeats these words every time it thunders. So you might, if you were wanting to make a kind of comparison to narratives that may be familiar, in some sense to you, you might think of rainbows and Noah's Ark, right? The rainbow as the pledge that the world will not be destroyed by flood. So every time one sees a rainbow, you're sort of reminded of the pledge, and of the covenant. So there's something comparable here. When it thunders, God is speaking. So I'll just read these sections. Da or data. What have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries or in memories draped by the beneficent spider or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Dayadvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors revive for a moment, a broken Coriolanus. Da Damyata. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. The sea was calm. That's important. The weight of these words or their significance, I think, is confounding. On the one hand, they seem to demand precisely what has not been present in the Wasteland thus far. The first word calls for some kind of act, some kind of giving that's not bound by the logic of profit and loss, something that escapes the world of calculation. The second word turns us to the story of Count Ugolino in the Inferno, but his prison tower, described for us at the bottom of the Inferno, becomes here an image of a fundamental isolation, a subjective disconnect between ourselves and others. And the third word easily reads initially as an invitation to exercise control, but it is in fact just the opposite. It's a word that counsels us to discern the joy in obedience, the joy of being controlled. Eliot's evocation of da, da, da is in part indebted to his studies in Eastern religion and Sanskrit at Harvard. The idea of primal or fundamental linguistic units was of sincere interest to him, right? The way these primal units, fundamental units, combine and recombine to form meaning. But as so often seems to be the case, and as I suggested at the beginning of the lecture, this more grave reading of the sacred syllable is complicated by Eliot's knowledge of Dadaism, the nonsense artistic movement of the early 20th century. The poem slides between the somber and the popular, in much the same way that the final word of the text, shanti, can double as the word shanty or sea-song. So there's a kind of movement, right, between meanings. If you look at the letters that Eliot and Pound exchange, Pound is constantly using language in this way. So he might mean to say shanty sea-song, but he'll write the word shanty. He's constantly engaged in that kind of linguistic play. The final lines of the poem are, I think, arguably amongst the most dizzying in all of modern poetry. If we were back on some kind of narrative track, the dissolution of the poem into this raucous kind of bricolage or collage that makes up the poem's last lines creates both a sense of collapse and maybe a sense of relief. On the one hand, many have argued that there is a clear, if tenuous, affirmation of the spiritual life at the end of the poem, in the words shanti, 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 which Eliot tells us are roughly equivalent to the Christian conception, the peace which passes all understanding. Peace, peace, peace. On the other hand, one may read the outburst of fragments as a return to the chaos and disorder of the wasteland itself. The words of religious peace are only one more fragment amongst many in the compendium of world culture that Eliot has stitched together for us, none more significant than any other, or at least none any more likely to provide solace and consolation or certainty. All of them, Eliot says, are shored against his ruins. We might want to think about that image given your reflections on wholeness. What does it mean to have fragments shored against ruins, the partial against the partial, the incomplete against the incomplete? We'll consider this when we look more closely at the poem later this week in light of Eliot's lifelong engagement with Dante. But I'd simply begin by suggesting that what Eliot is getting at here is not so much, I don't think, an either or. That is to say, not a yes to the possibility of redemption or a no, though many, I think, rightly see this poem as a story modeled in large part on the exodus of the people of Israel, but in a certain sense, it's an exodus with no promised land, right? But rather, it seems to me that Eliot wants to sketch a portrait of the community, of the human community in the wake of the First World War that is haunted by narratives of redemption and counsels of wisdom, but for whom the combined weight of habit and fear and anxiety make the appropriation of those words extremely uncertain. You might have recall from his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, that Eliot champions a form of poetry that he calls the impersonal. As Eliot notes elsewhere, what he means by personal, the principle he's anxious about, is something, for the personal for Eliot, is an overly stabilized subjectivity, one that has no porousness and can let nothing in. So I think this is something of the problem of the wasteland, that there's too much personality in a way, right? People are too consolidated in a way. As the Fisher King says plaintively at the very beginning of the poem's final stanza, shall I set my lands in order? That is to say, shall I act, right? There's a question. Will anything be done to right what is wrong? When Eliot expresses his impersonal theory of poetry in the essay that we've read for this week, he sets it against, as I've noted, the problem of personality he sees as the inheritance of 19th century Romanticism. Personality for Eliot presupposes fixity, habit, and a kind of enclosure, and he'll be critical not only of the Romantics, but in a certain sense, he finds an echo in early criticisms of Picasso's Cubism. But that's something we could talk about. But by Bulgakov makes some very interesting criticisms of Cubism as a demonic art. And Eliot writes a very interesting essay on the problem of personality and the demonic in modernist literature. But we can perhaps talk about that another time. So I'll just conclude, because it's been a long lecture, so I apologize. I'll just conclude. In 1939, so some 17 years after the publication of The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot posed a question that I think frames the problem of the poem in a very helpful way. He says that he had begun to ask himself, was our society, which had always been so assured of its superiority and rectitude, so confident of its unexamined premises, was it assembled around anything more permanent than the world of banks, insurance companies, and industries? And had it any beliefs more essential than a belief in compound interest and the maintenance of dividends? Eliot's personal resolution of the problem posed by The Wasteland is bound up in some sense with the life he lived, or maybe not in some sense, fundamentally with the life he lived. Decisive for him was a religious conversion in 1927, a development which Virginia Woolf called obscene, but which Eliot himself referred to simply as an expansion of interests. Very interesting, so it simply expanded my interests. Remarkably, the primary images of his poetry and plays, both pre- and post-conversion, remain largely consistent with the world of The Wasteland. Indeed, as Alan and I were discussing earlier, to read his famous four quartets, which is to see a kind of rewriting of The Wasteland almost in its entirety, or a re-engagement with its content. Eliot is, throughout his career, concerned with deserts, with dry lands, with existential agonies, with the purification of desire, and so on. All of that is another story, but it's a story that Eliot frames for us in his play, The Family Reunion. As I noted at the beginning of our lecture, in that play he asks, where does one go from a world of insanity? And the response is given, one goes somewhere on the other side of despair. It seems to me that there is a kind of despair that befits the modern world and its contradictions. Eliot would concede this much. But for him, the more interesting question, and perhaps the more interesting question for us, is what lies on the other side of that sadness. It's this that I hope to explore on Wednesday evening when we consider Eliot's engagement with Dante. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Ralston College podcast. Today's episode featured a lecture on arguably the greatest of modernist poems, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, given by Christopher Snook, a lecturer in the Department of Classics at Dalhousie University and a scholar of literary modernism. His lecture was delivered as part of the curriculum of the 2023-24 Masters in the Humanities Program at Ralston College. If you enjoyed this talk, I'd encourage you to consider applying to be a member of next year's cohort in the Masters in the Humanities program. It's an enormously demanding, dynamic, and above all, rewarding program that joins the study of philosophy, language, literature, and art. It opens with 2 full months of immersive study of Greek in Greece. After completing this intensive language course, which I often describe as boot camp meets the grand tour, students travel to Savannah, where they continue their language study as they also trace an ambitious curriculum through the development of Western civilization from ancient times to the present, all in the context of a lively community defined by friendship and freedom of thought. You can visit our website for more information or to request an application. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Till next time.